In this video, we'll continue with Unit 2, and we'll be talking more about some of the functions of skin. And this isn't really, functions works, I guess, but think more of like, what is skin doing? What is it producing? Why is it producing these things? I think that's a better way of looking at it. The first thing we're going to look at is skin color. Skin color actually has several factors that cause it. That's why there's so many different skin colors out there. There's just, there's not like three. There's so many different, and because it was several underlying factors. The first one we've already talked about, and that is this pigment called melanin. Now, interesting, as far as human evolution is concerned, people that tend to live near the equator had darker skin, and people who lived further away from the equator had lighter skin, which makes sense if you think about it, because where is the most UV light going to be occurring? And it's going to be near the equator. Obviously, as history has played out and civilization has played out, people have moved all over the place for this reason and that, and are located all over the place now. But as far as human evolution is concerned, the darker the skin is typically closer to the equator, because that skin pigment melanin, its primary purpose is to protect versus UV radiation. And people who live further away from the equator aren't getting those direct UV rays, and so they tend to be lighter skinned. Again, all humans have relatively the same number of melanocytes. It's just that people who have darker skin produce much more melanin, and their keratinocytes, those surrounding epidermal cells, retain that melanin for a much longer period of time. You can, if you expose yourself to regular UV radiation, your skin will actually begin to produce more of that melanin in order to respond to that. And so that's, what we think of as tanning, but you can damage your skin that way. And yeah, that's a whole other discussion. And a couple other things that can affect skin color. One of those is carotene. Carotene is a vitamin that's found in a lot of vegetables, and it has an orangish, yellowish kind of color to it. And carotene is important because it's converted to vitamin A by our bodies, and it's a necessary component of epidermal health. Well, what happens, carotene is a fat-soluble vitamin, and so it stays in our skin. It kind of hangs out there, and it's waiting to be used. And so it can cause skin to look more or less yellow. And so, you'll hear all these stories about babies eating too many carrots and turning orange. Well, there's some truth to that, because the skin does want that carotene, and if it has too much, it definitely can change the pigment of the skin. And so that degree of yellow can have to do with the amount of carotene in the skin. And then lastly is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the molecule that takes oxygen in for our red blood cells and causes that molecule to turn red, or the red blood cells to be red. Well, of course, our skin is not red, but underneath our skin, where the blood vessels are, there's lots of those capillaries and such, can give skin a more or less pinkish hue. And so that pink in there can also cause skin color to be different. And you see this picture with all these different arms. You think about all the different factors that go into skin color. They're literally, each color is almost unique in its variation. So let's talk about hair. Hair is it's another deep subject, so we're just going to kind of hit the surface here. Hair is a necessary component of skin. For us as humans, we don't use hair the same way that mammals do. Mammals use their hair a lot for temperature regulation, and then somewhat of a protective armor, depending on the type of mammal. Their hair very much serves to protect them from the blows of would-be enemies or whatever. But for us, we just don't have a whole lot of that hair, so it can't really serve those purposes. In some parts of our head, it does have that for those people who have hair on their head. And so it can do that, but it really serves another function for us, is that it's a sensory function. Our hair will tell us first if something's moving on us, like a bug or something like that, which could be bad for our health. And it tells the wind blowing and that sort of thing. So it does serve a sensory function for us. There are hairs that protect certain areas of the body. Like you think of the nasal passages, those hairs are there to protect the nasal passage. And so there are some specialized hairs in other parts of the body, eyelashes, of course. But for the most part, hairs don't serve a whole lot of function. Hairs are flexible strands. They're produced by hair follicles, and they are mostly composed of dead keratinized cells. And so a hair is just a bunch of cells. You can kind of see it on these pictures here, and it's got many layers. We're not going to get into the layers of the hair, but a hair is nothing more than just a bunch of cells that are slowly being keratinized. They're being pushed out toward the end, and so you've heard of you can get someone's DNA out of their hair. Yeah, absolutely, because there's cells in there, and those cells contain that DNA, and so it's easy. It would be easy to do that. The hair follicle extends down into the dermis, but notice what it's surrounded by. It's still surrounded by epidermal tissue. And so you can kind of think of a hair follicle as being this indentation of the epidermis. And at the base of the hair, you have this thing called the hair bulb, and the hair bulb is wrapped in nerve endings, and it extends down into the dermal layer and has a blood supply so that the hair can be nourished, and there's nerves again wrapped around that hair follicle. There's a lot going on with hair growth, and a lot of research, particularly cancer research and some other things, use hair follicles because of the amount of growth that is happening on them. And you can study those cells really quickly. But for our purposes, we're going to leave much of that unknown. Encourage you to study that if it interests you. It is pretty fascinating. Moving on to nails. Again, nails have varying functions across other mammals, but for us, we really don't use them to, attack prey and that sort of thing. So we typically think of your nails as protecting your fingertips. The fingers of humans are very important because we are tactile and we use tools and that sort of thing. So it's a very important part of our existence. So our fingertips do need to be protected. So those nails protect them. They allow us to pick up objects. They allow us to scratch and that sort of thing. So they do have some purpose. Nails contain keratin as well. It's a different kind of keratin that's found in hairs. It's more of this really hard keratin. So it does have different properties than the keratin that is found in hair. A nail bed, which you can see here, the nail bed is where your nail kind of lays on and slides across as it grows. And it's the deepest layers. So right underneath this nail bed is still epidermis, but it represents like the deepest layers of the epidermis. So if you've ever lost a nail and that part gets exposed, it's really sensitive because it's not used to seeing the outside world. Those cells haven't been keratinized and so forth, but they do quickly get keratinized as they're exposed. The nail matrix back here, this is where all the growth is happening. Not a whole lot going on with nails. I mean, there's a lot. Again, deep subject, grab a hold of it, but for us, we're going to keep it about there. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the different types of glands found in the skin. There are two types of sweat glands. Sweat glands are distributed over the majority of the body, and each person has around 3 million or so, give or take, 1,000 probably or so. Two types of sweat glands found in humans: eccrine sweat glands on the left and apocrine sweat glands found there on the right. Let's talk about the difference. Eccrine sweat glands, these are found they're much more numerous than apocrine sweat glands, for one, and they're typically found, they're all over the body, but there's a lot of them on palms, feet, forehead, and their purpose is to release a material called sweat, which you're familiar with. They have a duct that here's a sweat gland. They release their material directly onto the skin right here, as you can see that. And the sweat is actually hypotonic to the blood. And what that means is there's less solute in the sweat than there is in the blood. 90% of sweat is water, but there is some metabolic waste that is released with sweat. There's actually a protein that called dermacidin, and that the purpose of the protein is to actually kill microbes that are on the surface of the skin, or at least help to control the growth of those microbes. Sweat has a much lower pH than water, so it actually can deter a lot of microbial growth. And the big purpose, of course, for sweat is to keep the body from overheating. Body will release sweat because water retains a lot of energy, and by getting rid of that water, it can get rid of all that energy and thus cool the body down. Next is the apocrine sweat glands. These are primarily found like axillary region, which is the armpit. There are around 2,000 of these, and they are deep in the dermis. They release their material directly into the hair follicle. And it's similar to sweat, but they also release a lot of fatty materials and some proteins as well. And this type of sweat is odorless by itself. However, when it comes in contact with the bacteria that live in those areas, they then the bacteria start to eat those fatty substances and proteins and decompose, and that is what produces the unpleasant odor that we typically associate with sweat. Eccrine sweat glands don't really do this. Apocrine sweat glands, these are the stinky sweat glands. This is what produces body odor. So typically these things, the apocrine sweat glands begin functioning at puberty, and they are turned on by the production of male hormones. And so males, of course, have more of these because they're male hormones, but females also produce male hormones and serve an important part in female systems as well, but they have a lot less of this hormone, and so they're less likely to have that sort of issue. Next are sebaceous glands. These are found all over the body except for the palms and the soles of feet. These are typically known as oil glands, and they secrete an oily substance called sebum, which you can see there. And they're connected right to the hair follicle most of the time, not always necessarily. And the purpose of the sebaceous gland, again, to release sebum, which lubricates the hair, lubricates the skin. It contains a bactericidal compound, which again controls the amount of bacteria on the skin. These sebaceous glands can actually become infected and inflamed, and this is the whole root behind acne. And acne is a deep subject as well, but that's the basis behind it, is that sebum becomes blocked up in there and it causes the sebaceous gland to get infected, and there's some other things that go on there. So let's quickly talk about skin as a barrier. This is a pretty simple idea, but it's important. Skin serves as a chemical barrier, which we've kind of mentioned already, because skin produces substances that have a lower pH, and it causes bacteria multiplication to be lower than it normally would. And skin produces a physical barrier. This is important. If you just pour water on your skin, it doesn't seep into your bones, because your skin is knit together with these tight junctions and desmosomes. The desmosomes keep your skin from falling apart. The tight junctions keep things from seeping in. Now, there are some things that can penetrate into our skin. Lipid-soluble substances can do that. There are a type of compound called oleoresins. You don't have to know oleoresins, but you are familiar with them. These are resins that are produced by plants like poison ivy and poison oak. They can seep right into your skin, and skin becomes inflamed, and it is not fun. Organic solvents like acetone, that you may be familiar with using like in a chemistry lab, these can soak right into your skin. Heavy metal salts. Mercury is the best example of this. You don't want to handle mercury because it can literally seep right into your skin and cause some problems. And there are actually some medications that work this way as well, that are lipid soluble, and so they can seep right into your skin and then get into your bloodstream. There's a lot of medications that sometimes people will have a patch that releases that medicine at regular intervals or whatever, because it uses that same sort of technology.